This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the EU-friendly edition of the Gateway API meeting, December 5th, 2023. As usual, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, boiling down to please be nice to one another, so please do be nice to one another. It is helpful if you use the raise hand feature. If you have questions or interjections as we discuss topics, please use that feature. It helps us to organize and kind of keep things flowing. We have a few items on the agenda for today. They're kind of coming in as we go here. It's an open agenda, so if you have something, please do feel free to put it at
Shane, you're going
Yep.
robot-y on us. Is your
the bottom of the
internet working
agenda,
out
and if we can
again?
get to it today, we will. Otherwise, we can fold it over. Am I having problems?
Yeah.
Where did I
You
get cut off
were,
at?
you're back for now. If you disappear, I can take over for a bit.
Okay, where did I cut out?
Please add things to the agenda if you have them, and otherwise off we go, I think was what it boiled down to.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think we're okay.
Yeah. If we have any, I didn't miss much then. If anybody here is kind of new and wants to introduce themselves, we'll give a couple of seconds before we get started on the agenda to do that.
I'm
And again,
Divya Soundarajan.
hi.
I'm real-time working in Kubernetes and OpenShift, and I really want to contribute myself to the open source project, and I really don't know how to start with. I'm starting with joining this meeting.
That's an
Someone can
excellent
help,
start.
like how I can contribute, or your suggestions are welcome. Yeah.
Cool.
Welcome.
Do you have an implementation of Gateway API that you're familiar with?
No.
That's probably the best first place to start, is to like gravitate towards implementation. So I don't know, you're at Red Hat, so I don't know if you work with Candace and Grant
Okay,
Spence.
I can see law government saying opportunities in English gateway. I don't mind to study what is that, but how I really start my hands and how I can contribute here.
Yeah, so yeah, well, maybe we can check out after, but yeah, what like Gateway API
Very
is
cool. Very cool.
what is it? What is it? Sir?
Thank you, Leah. I'll
I
be
think I'm having problems. Rob, you might have to go. You might have to run it. I'm having
Yeah, I can do that.
all kinds
That's
of
fine.
difficulties apparently. Hopefully you can hear me right now, but I just wanted to say thank you, welcome, and assuming you continue to still hear me, please please do catch up with us on the Kubernetes Slack, SIG Network Gateway API. We'll be happy to help you find your way through like the ecosystem and get involved, and we're very glad
Sure.
to have you involved. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? New, want to introduce yourself? Just even say hi. Okay, I'll let you go, Rob, just because I think I'm going to continue to have problems.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. But somewhat ironically, the first item on the agenda is yours, so we'll come right back to you momentarily. But I have my own thoughts, so let me well, no, you can start us off, and if you cut out,
No,
I'll
you go
jump
ahead.
in.
I just put this on here as a reminder, like a post KubeCon
Okay.
reminder that we needed to talk about this again. So you can drive it.
Okay, sure, great. So yeah, one of the recurring themes at KubeCon was how on earth we manage CRDs, especially now that these CRDs are labeled GA. It started to get some attention from other SIGs, other maintainers, etc., and started to ask where these might belong and how we could potentially simplify installation. One of the leading theories has been maybe we should tie these CRDs to cluster provisioners, cluster provisioning tools and providers. So anyone who's running a managed Kubernetes offering, or anyone who is maintaining a tool like KOps, Cluster API, etc., basically adding it at that layer as a add-on for your cluster. But this again kind of goes with the idea that these exist once for the cluster, so they kind of belong at a cluster admin kind of level, or at least the management of them does. And so yeah, that's a working theory. Have some open threads, like for example, maintainer of KOps to follow up there, and there are some people that really want to see this move forward. I think the onus is on us as a project to give some recommendations. Like if we as a project say that, hey, we really think this should be owned by cluster provisioners or at that step of the life cycle, then we should provide some guidelines and then talk to those tools, to those projects. But it kind of needs to start with us as far as what we think and what we recommend should happen here. So open to feedback and discussion on this, but obviously my biased opinion is that, yeah, it would be great if this was owned by your kind of cluster provisioning or management tooling. If maybe another way to say this is, if anybody thinks this should belong somewhere else, now's a great time to speak up, or else we may just continue down that path of making a recommendation that's where it lives. But Keith?
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I moved my headphones over, wasn't sure if it took. So I'm kind of on two minds on this. I do think that it makes things really nice. The spec of the Gateway API can kind of assume something else is doing the provisioning, even your cluster provider. I think where it gets difficult, speaking on behalf, working for one of those cluster providers, is when you've got different components, maybe different tools that require different things. So as a hypothetical, let's say that that's not even hypothetical. So Microsoft has a managed Istio service, and if the customer wants to run a Gateway API within Istio, that might require, let's say that requires an experimental feature. We also have a L7 ingress controller, but let's say that that requires the standard channel in a certain version. And then on top of that, there is a thing that bundles the load balancer with some Azure DNS stuff and puts it all like as a training wheels for newer Kubernetes adopters. That requires another version. And so as a cluster provider, it becomes challenging to figure out how to kind of balance all that and manage all of that across all the different versions. And the matrix is horrible, especially when you start factoring in upgrades and things like that. I see Rob laughing, so I'm guessing you're having similar conversations. And so some of the advice I've given internally has been to kind of maybe have a set of defaults, like a base install, and then if users have a component or a tool or something that they want that requires a more experimental or a different version, they can install those CRDs and have it overwrite. But it does get challenging to try to manage some of those matrices. And so maybe even if we do decide to have the cluster provider own it, I think what would be great for Gateway API to provide maybe would be some guidance for managing for how users and the cluster provider should kind of co-own some of that. Because we didn't even get to non-cluster provider managed features. So if you're running Azure and you've got the load balancer, but you want to run Kong as well for something, or you want to run a number of gateways that you manage yourself, that's another thing added into the matrix. And so I think discussion of that co-ownership, some published guidance of some sort, even if it's a couple of sentences, I think would be really helpful to disambiguate here.
Yeah, those are really great points. Maybe I'll jump in and respond to a couple of them real quickly, because yeah, as you'd expect, I also have working for GKE, and being very familiar with managing gateway CRDs for better or for worse. We have many different components that build on top of Gateway and have their own expectations. The working theory has been that we can install the latest set of standard CRDs and roll that out to the rest of the clusters, the rest of the fleet, in short order, right? Because gateway versioning policy, et cetera, ensures that changes are backwards compatible, et cetera. This also enables anyone, customers, users, et cetera, to manually install experimental CRDs that are not included in standard channel. Where it gets really messy is if you want, say, the experimental version of HTTP route that is also in standard channel, but you could install the experimental version of TLS route because there's nothing competing with that.
And
These are
simply
all
a thing that I think will be really common if people want to test out one new field.
Yeah, no, that is,
Yeah.
and I'll be frank right now that GK in particular has relied on other implementations and feedback from others to really test out experimental features. So that's a real blind spot, and as Mike and others have pointed out, that is a weakness of cluster of managing this at the cluster provisioning or cluster management layer, because most managed tools are not going to want to install the experimental version and roll back changes automatically, because that is, not something like anybody wants, right? It's really risky, breaking changes happen, etc. Not sure on that. Maybe what we need, maybe one take here is that this is a opt-in, and like this is something that is available to provide more stability, but not something that people need to rely on. But maybe with that, I've spoken a lot, and Flynn has been very patient, so let me hand off to Flynn.
As patient as I ever am. Keith actually covered some of what I was going to say. The thing that I really wanted to emphasize here is that it's very well and good for us to say, oh, the cluster provider owns this, but that is not actually going to end up flying in practice for all the reasons that Keith mentioned, and because it's, on the one hand, you may be on a cluster where the provider did not provide it, and so the end user has to manage it anyway, or somebody who isn't the cluster provider at least had to manage it anyway. Or you may end up in a situation where, for example, you're running on a GKE cluster, but you're trying to work with a Gateway API implementation, and so you're trying to advance the state of Gateway API, and you need to be using your very own custom things. So I ran headlong into that one with Emissary, where I realized that there was no way at all to convince my GKE cluster not to take over the entire world of Ingress controllers for me years and years ago. And it was, it was an interesting situation there, and we're definitely going to run into that one. So I'm not sure I really have answers here, but I do think it's important to recognize that no matter what we do, that roles other than the cluster provider absolutely must be able to mess with this stuff. Unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think that although I would love to see cluster providers provide this option for the 90% of users, customers that want just the stable version of this API, we absolutely need to make it possible for people to experiment, or else the whole premise of things soaking in experimental and getting feedback is going to be completely ruined. I would like to follow up with you, maybe async, on like what GK did to break ingress. But that is definitely not intentional. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, I should phrase that differently. It's this is an old conversation that we've already had, where there's magic with load balancer types that is simply not accessible if you're not the cluster provider, is a better way to phrase that one.
Yeah.
And so, getting access to the magic for somebody trying to work with implementations is going to be very important. For Gateway API, that means that we have to be able to control the CRDs ourselves.
Yeah. Well said. Costin, I think you're next.
Yeah.
We agree, but define ourselves. That's really the question. So I think definitely not the gateway provider, because a gateway provider is just one of the many providers in a cluster. You can have Istio, you can have Linkerd, you can have, JK Gateway, you can have many providers. So neither of them owns the decision about what CRDs to install. I also don't think the platform provider should own it because they really don't know what the user wants. And again, they are also one of the vendors that provide a gateway implementation. However, the middle ground, and one thing that we've been trying to do with Istio is to say that the cluster admin, which is really responsible for all the decision about what controllers to use, what to allow, what not to allow, is the one that should decide what version of the CRD to install and what other vendor extensions to install, because it's not only experimental, it's also, do you want to install Istio virtual service and all the vendor specific extensions? Do you want to install Linkerd, or do you want to just rely on the standard gateway API and nothing else? And that's really a cluster-wide decision made by the admin. In JK, perhaps, in Rapid, you would install experimental and, Istio alpha features and enable everything, but in production cluster, you may probably not want to do that, even if everyone is actually doing it with Istio. But my point is, we need to look at this problem at a larger scale. It's not only specific to gateway, CRD itself. It also involves vendor extensions. It also involves experimental features in other parts of the system. And whatever solution we recommend should probably be generic enough that others can follow the same pattern. So Istio, for example, could say, hey, gateway is doing that. Let's do the same thing and provide a dial for the admin to choose if they want, stable or not stable, like we're kind of doing in the versioning, V1 or crazy. So anyway, that's my opinion, and that's what we've been also talking about in Istio for quite a while with all the alpha features that everyone is using in production and causing problems for everyone. So I personally think the model in JK of rapid and stable is not bad, and it's a perfect match for what we are discussing. I mean, you test on rapid, which is the latest, has all the features. It's as experimental as it goes, and then you deploy in production on stable, where hopefully everyone would have stable software, including Istio and including everyone else. But anyway, that's my opinion. Please consider as a vendor extension. Anyway, that was really what I was raising my hand for, but I got cut up responding to others.
Yeah, no, those are great comments, and I agree. We need to have some written guidelines here for that include recommendations for how extensions are installed as well. Yeah, and kind of what Damien is saying in chat as well is just that there's not going to be a one size fits all solution, but having this available in multiple ways to make it as easy as possible to manage Gateway API is, I think, a win. Lior?
Sorry, yeah. I wanted to ask if it's like it's going to be a form of recommendation from us, because we not really able to enforce anything. So for example, I don't know, like if GKE manage the lifecycle of gateway, whereas like, I don't know, AWS decide not to. So is it just in the form of a recommendation on the, I don't know, on the website or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The most we can really do here is recommendation. There are, other cluster provisioning tools, for example, that are within Kubernetes org that we might have a bit more sway or influence on, but obviously other providers, for example, are going to be harder to, it's completely up to them.
Yeah. So I think
recommendations are definitely worthwhile, though, particularly for particularly for an API as complex as this one.
So yeah, I think it's as I wrote in chat, I think it's worth following up on a GitHub discussion if there isn't one yet. And yeah, I think this recommendation, like, we should formalize this recommendation as like, more than just recommendation, because I guess especially for users who have like managed cloud provider or cluster provider who have no visibility of whether the gateway CRDs is controlled, it might be really confusing. So we need to have some uniformity around implementations and providers.
Yeah, no, completely agree with that. I think maybe I'll take that AI to start a discussion with this. And then I think there's been some really good feedback here. Maybe anyone who's commented here or has maybe additional comments they'd like to add, we can follow up async on that GitHub discussion. Any last comments for this meeting before we move on? Cool. All right. Well, this is a really good discussion. I will try and follow up probably sometime today with just a discussion to keep that going. The next one on the agenda is actually mine, and that is, and also big thank you to whoever, I think maybe multiple people have been writing notes. This is really helpful. So thank you. The thing I wanted to call out is we had a blog post go out in the past week, a week ago, I'd say, that had kind of taken longer than I think any of us wanted to get through. Thank you to everyone for their patience for getting this one through. But you know, I spent some time talking with SIG docs and with Tim in particular on the docs side for recommendations for how we could improve that going forward, so we're not kind of stuck. And I think it's very likely that Gateway API as a project is going to want to continue to contribute blog posts to Kubernetes IO. And one of the recommendations that Tim had is that if we had somebody from Gateway API that was a SIG docs approver, that would be, you know, that would help enable us to get blog posts out with the timing that we really expect. For example, right now they are looking for a 30-day lead time. So from when we actually, you know, we need to have something out basically a month before we want to have it published, which is particularly challenging because we don't really often know everything that's going to make the cut a month in advance, for example. So with that said, if anybody is looking for ways to contribute and particularly has an interest in docs, blog posts, we obviously need plenty of help within Gateway API itself. But one way you could help Gateway API would be to start ramping up as a SIG docs representative for the blog subproject, but then also for Gateway API itself. So if anyone is seeing that and saying, hey, this is an area I want to be involved in, yeah, just a call for volunteers on this one.
This SIG docs, what you're talking about is all about Network Gateway API?
So SIG docs is broader, actually. SIG docs is, it covers, in this case, we absolutely need help. We need somebody to own documentation for Gateway API itself. But what I'm really talking about here is kind of an expert on the blog side, which would cover anything going to the Kubernetes blog, reviewing and eventually approving anything on that front. But this would be, you know, it would take some time, probably 6 months plus, to go from reviewing to, say, approving those kind of blog posts.
There's a really interesting question there for how broad the responsibilities they're looking for are and how much time it would take, which is why I'm not immediately going, oh yeah, I'll do that. And I think it would be nice to find out more about that for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry. I also want to be explicit here. I'm not trying to scare anybody away. I'm just pointing out that SIG docs is much broader than the Gateway API stuff. And
yes.
So it's worth spending some time to learn about what they're really after and what their take on the responsibilities is, things like that.
Yeah, for sure. So for a little more context, SIG docs reviewers as a whole usually focus on style and formatting and such. and they will usually defer to subject matter experts for whatever the blog post is actually focused on. Usually when I think of these kind of roles, I expect a 2-hour a week kind of commitment, but I'd have to confirm with Tim for specifics. But yeah, great questions. Let me, John, I'm not sure how soon you need to, oh, you have to drop for a bit. Okay, so I'll come back. Or are you still here, John?
I'm here, but I have to leave in like a minute.
Okay, but you may be back later?
Maybe, but probably not. So just feel free to skip if not. It's not a big deal.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
We could certainly move that. Could certainly move that one to next week as well, because I mean, I'd like to hear about what's up with Ambient and Gateway API.
Yeah, I can. I'll chat with you offline as well. Just to keep you up to date. But I'll come back next week as well.
Cool.
Enjoy.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, maybe just follow up async. You can, anyone who's interested, ping me on Slack. I think this is, you know, the Kubernetes blog has really helped bring attention to Gateway API. Some of our blog posts have been pretty widely read and circulated. And so I'd love to have a good pipeline to that for the success of the project as a whole. So if anybody, you know, is really interested in docs, that would be a great win for us. Okay. With that, yeah, so Divya, definitely, if you can, sorry, yeah, anyone who's interested, if you can just ping me on Slack afterwards. Unfortunately, the Zoom chat just gets lost afterwards, and I'm awful at following up or catching everything in there. So just if you can find me on Slack, that'd be great. Lior?
Yes, so I actually wanted to ask if I can go now because I'm on call and have some pings. So I'll probably need to drop. Yeah. Yeah, so just like a few things. So just a call out to Dimitri. I think he's in John's team, and probably like he already started to add and work on is2 support for gateway, for ingress to gateway, which is not an easy task. So we already merged some code for like base support, but yeah, so we're still working to follow up. So also, if I know there were other issues that were open about supporting other providers, but yeah, I know users will definitely appreciate it. And for the next bullet, yeah. So yeah, for the next bullet, I actually wanted to see if anyone is planning to support GEP 2162. I know that Cadence opened an issue to track who supports what, but I wasn't able, like, I didn't follow up on this, but yeah, it was experimental and got into V1, but I don't think anyone supports it yet. So I'm just
that's a good point. I think one of the things we can do here and should do as soon as possible is, unless it's already been done and I missed it, but would be just to make conformance tests run off of this by default. And you know, people can choose other ways, but I think this would be a decent kind of forcing function or encouraging function if the default for a conformance test was to read from this.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about it, but yeah, just wanted to have maybe one feedback from one implementation that supported to see before we enforce it. But yeah, that's the reason I'm seeking for at least one implementation to implement it first. Keith.
Hey, yeah, I think that there are some things that are being lightly discussed in Istio where we might end up using this. I think John's ambient discussion may go into it, so I want to step on his toes. But yeah, the answer, I've got a potential yes out there for using the gap. So hopefully next week or so we'll have a better idea.
Mattia or Cadence, not sure who's first.
Yeah. My internet connection broke down when you were speaking, so you maybe you may have already answered this question, but here at Kong we are considering implementing the gap, but there is some, let's say, concern about the feature not being yet standard. So there is some concern about implementing, putting this effort for an experimental feature. And my question is, what do we need to have such a feature in standard? Because I think, sorry, I think that one of the points should be conformance test, but I don't understand how we can implement conformance tests for these features particularly, because this feature is implementation based, and how can we implement some conformance tests for implementation based features? So it's something not clear to me.
So yeah, I mean, I can take that, and Rob, if you have different ideas, you can jump in. But I think the only thing that stops this from being a standard feature now is we wanted feedback. I guess we all want this feature to get in, and I don't see a way for this feature to be dropped, although it's experimental. And there were efforts to also make it in V1. I think this feature is gonna improve UX and like user experience for users for sure, and potentially can be based for automation, for blocking of ending configurations, whether it's with gateway cattle or with something else. There were also discussions, I guess, probably in this document, a few meetings before one of the email ones that I've joined, about how to conformance test this feature, which I can probably reference later. But yeah, I guess the conclusion we got is like we need to move conformance tests to work based on this feature, which is probably going to be a kind of conformance test by itself, because if an implementation doesn't check, like if implementation doesn't populate the regular fields, so it probably not going to run the tests and not going to have the in their report, it's not going to be marked as passed. But yeah, if anyone has different opinions, feel free to loop in.
So maybe, yeah, it is kind of a chicken and egg circular reasoning, whatever, right? Conformance tests of conformance tests, basically, or of a conformance test feature. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is, and I hate to, I should, yeah, I'll be really quick, because just because Leo mentioned me, I think that one thing we could do here is call out specifically that add a supported feature for this, for supported features supported, I don't know, whatever, and basically only populate that if that is how the conformance tests were run, so that you still get that feedback in conformance tests. In my opinion, this is a fairly straightforward feature that should not take that much effort to get to standard, but of course it does require some real usage and feedback and the same graduation criteria as the rest. But maybe Candace, I think you might have been next.
Yes, I just wanted to put in a plug for the pull request, calling implementers to fill in their status or plans for the 16 open gaps that we have now, the 16 open experimental and or provisional gaps that we have now. This has been open for a couple of weeks, and if if it's not the right way to collect this information, I'll just close it, because I've only gotten two implementers' responses on it. But the idea was just to try to collect information.
I like the idea of collecting the information, and I apologize for not going and poking at it earlier. KubeCon ate my brain.
Yeah, I think it overlaps with the next item on the agenda for me, the project board. But in both cases, we still need a lot of help to collect the information. And so I'm glad the pull request exists. And I hope that more people are able to contribute their own status to it. So yeah, thanks for that shout out. I think, who is this next? Sorry, I can't see names for whatever reason.
Guillaume
Somebody
has
else
his hand up.
Yeah, cheers. So I'm conscious about time, so I'm trying to be quick. And I also dropped my question in the document just in case we need to follow up offline later. But I had a question which is somewhat similar to Matthias before, where I'm also interested about standardized feature names versus non-standardized feature names. And I wonder whether the gap has any chance to evolve in the future for supporting also non-standardized feature names, such as like kinds of policies.
You know, that's a really good question, and
that sounds like a great one to take offline.
Yeah, no, but I thought this was already covered somewhere. It was definitely a goal of mine to be able to have in the same place, not supported features, but supported resources, extensions, whatever we would call it, that was group kind resource, basically, or group version kind, some version, something like that.
I'm not sure I remember seeing that anywhere, Rob. So
it may be Leo. Yeah, go ahead.
There is a discussion. I tried to kick it off. Nick was really involved in discussion. I can try to find it, like probably discussions filtered by my name.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'll find it, and then anyone who's interested, just comment in. I didn't want to do the work without anyone being interested in it. And also, I remember it was during the big controversial discussion on the extension gap. So yeah, maybe we can revisit this one. So
yeah,
I'll paste it. I'll paste it here.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, for a second I was thinking, oh man, maybe this was just in my head the whole time. But thank you. I'm glad there was a real discussion somewhere. Cool. All right, let me keep on rolling here. I expect the next two after this are going to take some time. So let me just.
I'm going to try for the next two after this to not take a lot of time, but just.
You're more optimistic than me on that.
That you may be right.
Okay. All right, so let me real quick run through this. We've spent some time. You may have noticed if you're following GitHub that there were a bunch of changes to get this project board up to date, including opening some old issues that track gaps. We're trying to move more towards what Kubernetes Upstream is doing with gaps, where issues stay open until they graduate to standard, or until they're basically complete. In what that would mean in Gateway API case. So with that said, this gap board, I think everyone should be able to see this. Please let me know if you are not able to access via the link in the agenda. With that said, this is a list of all our experimental gaps and every other status as well that I'm aware of. I'm not sure who has access to edit or modify this. If you want access that you don't have, just ping. I don't really know how this works, but I know I have access and some others have access to modify this, and we're really using this as a tool to just try and make sense of this long set of experimental gaps that we are trying to get out of experimental. One of the things that came out of KubeCon very early on was just, we have a lot of new features, a lot of very good proposals coming in, but for the health of the project as a whole, we can't justify adding lots of new experimental features without getting some features out of experimental. And the path out of experimental can be to abandon. We can remove them from the API, or more likely and more ideally, we can try to graduate them to standard. And so what I try to do here is focus on graduated, when these graduated to begin with, when they became experimental. And you can see the very, very awkward detail that all of TLS, TCP, and UDP route actually were experimental as of 0.1. So the very, very beginning. So if you want to talk about perma experimental APIs, those are our biggest problems. And so I've been really thinking about what on earth to do there. You've probably seen some really discussions about those. If you haven't been following GitHub discussions for Gateway API, I'd encourage you to do that. There's been some really interesting threads recently from many different people. So yeah, anyway, I'm not sure what the answer is there, but I do know that we need to make some kind of progress or change on these ones, in my opinion. Then after those, the next oldest is policy attachment, which is, I'm sure, going to relate to what Flynn's going to talk about next. I'm of the personal opinion that I'd love to take a subset of that GEP and pull it out and work on graduating that. The GEP as a whole is just absolutely massive as it exists today. So I think our best path forward is to split it up into more manageable chunks.
I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Then there's this GEP for route port matching, and it just kind of fell off the radar, in my opinion. But it's basically in parent ref, we have a port, and that's existed since 0.5 in experimental. I believe it has a number of implementations, but I don't know who. And we just barely have conformance tests, thanks to, I think, Mattia for adding a supported feature for that recently, because we were testing it without supported feature, something like that. With that said, this is completely lacking an owner. And I think this one in particular is one where if there's nobody pushing it forward, it's just going to fall off, and I think we're just going to abandon it. So I would love to see someone pick this up if somebody's invested in this becoming standard. I think it needs a few more conformance tests and just somebody to own documentation for it, because you can see that, as far as I can tell, there's no docs for this feature either. But yeah, if there's nobody that's really interested in it, we can also get rid of it. That is experimental channel. So any volunteers, anybody, maybe before we get to volunteers, anybody who really wants to see this feature continue to exist in Gateway API?
I'm pretty sure Linkerd already implements matching routes on ports. So I will need to look into that a little bit, but we might need to continue for it to exist. John, you're raising your
Yeah, I
hand.
think we do as well. And service mesh is kind of broken if you don't have a port match.
It's challenging. Yeah, it would be hard for me to see how we get away from that. So
I expected that mesh in particular would really want this to exist.
I'll make you a deal, John. If you want to be the owner for this one, then I'll take the ownership for the timeout GEP that also has no owner.
Fine. I'll do it.
Hey, that's I'll go with it.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks.
Good deal.
I think I got the better end of that deal, so thank you.
I think I got the better end of that deal because the timeouts one is pretty much already done. I don't know. We'll find out.
Famous last words. We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you for being volunteered to take that on. Next up, I wanted to highlight gRPC route, which has been an API since 0.6. I chatted with Richard a bit about this. He is finding the time and prioritizing the final steps for this to graduate. That most notably includes conformance tests, which he is working on and aims to have in the next couple of months, based on discussion with him. So yeah, that is actually on track again and will not be forgotten. You may have noticed yesterday I added a note on the multi-cluster service GEP that it is basically stuck in experimental for a long time. The upstream multi-cluster service API is still alpha, and last I checked has some changes and things in flight that will mean it stays in alpha for probably another year is my guess. I don't know. I'm terrible at predicting these things. So this unfortunately means any gap based on that API can't really become GA just because the API it's based on isn't. So I think it's just going to stay in experimental for a while. Mike?
I am very interested in working upstream in SIG multi-cluster to help advance that, whether it needs like a V1 Alpha 3 or whatever it's at before it gets to beta. So definitely like let's sync up on what y'all want to see happen to be able to get those moving forward in that space if we're dependent on them. So yeah, I can potentially own that part of it.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. The people I checked in with just briefly from SIG multi-cluster whatever were just saying that they wanted to provide more observability, but basically more awareness in terms of what is happening behind the scenes here. So they're working on some standardization there before it graduated. I am sure having some additional perspective on that would be very useful. So yeah, let's follow up offline.
That's good.
Thank you. Cool.
Rob, I'm going to point out we have 9 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'll cut it there, but just as a high level thing, this project board exists. In general, we're trying to work down this list in terms of the things that have stuck in experimental for the longest are the things we're trying to push out of experimental. So yeah, that's kind of almost a priority list, though some are certainly harder than others.
And yeah, Rob, you can go ahead and put my name on row 14 of that.
Oh, sweet. Okay.
Yeah, that was
I will do that,
timeout
but don't let that distract you. You can go ahead and start on your agenda items while I do that.
Okay. I'm going to try to keep these short. Most of these are FYI type things because there's a fair amount of collecting of thoughts and writing things down that needs to happen. But Linkerd and Envoy Gateway are both in a situation where both of these projects kind of have to work ahead of the existing Gateway API implementations because there are things that we are trying to actually get done using Gateway API, as opposed to having existing APIs that we want to preserve, but also support Gateway API. Does that make any sense? So Envoy Gateway is natively Gateway API. It does not have any other configuration mechanism. Linkerd has some places where we have decided we want to use Gateway API instead of preserving the existing Linkerd service profile thing because it's a bit of a better fit. This raises some deeply, deeply fascinating questions the moment you sit down and go, all right, let me go through and actually take this existing application and express the things that I need to configure in terms of Gateway API resources. And you instantly find that you must either use the extension mechanisms built into Gateway API, or create your own API types, or sling annotations around all over the place. All three of these turn out to kind of have some serious issues, which is interesting. The most immediate reason I'm bringing this up is that there is a discussion, I don't remember the number, but there's a discussion now open talking about extension refs versus policy attachment. And there's some discussion in that discussion to the tune of, oh, we should really only have one way of doing things. It should all just be policy attachment. Oh, dear God, no, please don't go that route. I am putting together some examples of things that we ran across in Linkerd just this past week as we were going through this exercise where you can't usefully do things only with policy attachment. We really do need extension filters at present. And I don't want to try to go through and have that discussion right now without putting the examples together and giving people an opportunity to read them. And so hopefully I will have that out this week or so we can talk about it, sometime soon in real time. One of the other things we ran across is that right now in Gateway API, there is a limit of 16 rules in a route, and discussion to the tune of, oh, no, we don't want to just raise that limit or whatever. That feels like it's going to end up effectively being guidance that you should have exactly one rule per route. And that also introduces some really interesting things with respect to trying to configure policy with defaults and reuse things. And it gets to be fairly nasty fairly quickly. So that's actually all I wanted to say on that one. Was I am going to be doing a bunch of writing on this one. I have not had a chance to do it yet. There's some stuff there that I really want to get engaged in that discussion with. We also recently, the next topic, we also recently ran into a bug where Linkerd was stomping on the status for things that it did not own. A, I'm terribly sorry. B, I will be adding conformance tests for this. But C, it raises a really fascinating question about the fact that right now, you can talk about a route and you can definitively look at a route and decide whether that route belongs to a given gateway implementation. Because if it references a parent gateway of a particular gateway class, then you know for certain that that gateway controller should be messing with it. You can't do that for service mesh right now. All we can do is say things like, well, one of its parent refs is a service, so I guess that means we own it. And this is okay at the moment. We should probably be a little bit more explicit about that, that ownership thing in the documentation for service mesh. But at some point, I suspect we might also need to do something a little bit more dispositive than there's a service, so I guess it's mine. And that's another thing that I wanted to bring up so we could start thinking about it and talking about it over time. See, Rob, I said I was going to try to be quick.
Great points. I think Mike was going to say something, so I'll let you speak first. And
yeah, just that even assuming not having two different meshes fighting, like Istio will probably have a similar concern just within itself because of the ability to have like multiple revisions of the control plane. And determining which one is managing it. So
and
even just within Istio, we would have this issue.
Yeah, Linkerd kind of gets to avoid that. Kind of, but yeah, it's an interesting one. Lior, you were going to say?
Yeah, I wanted to say something slightly. You mentioned you're going to add another conformance test. So I wanted to ask, like, who's the owner for the mesh conformance test? Because
that's a lovely question.
Yeah,
I don't actually know.
It's just like it's really different than the regular conformance tests,
it's just there's a conformance profile for mesh, and some things don't run if you for example, if you only pick mesh conformance, then we don't run things that require you to be a gateway controller as well. I'm not sure there is a single owner of mesh conformance right now.
Yeah. From my perspective, I usually just try and defer, make sure at least one of the gamma leads, so that includes Flynn, would approve conformance PR if it touches mesh, but there's nothing formal there right now.
Yeah.
I would.
All right.
I would kind of like to hope we don't need anything more formal than that, but that might just be naive optimism on my part.
No, I just needed to follow up with naming conventions and stuff because the supported relates to supported features. But yeah, I would.
Feel free to talk to me about that, and we'll go from there. Yeah, me or John or Keith.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Well, this has been great discussion. I do want to end on time, so I think we'll bump John's item to next week. Yeah, this has been really great, and it seems like we have a few follow-ups that will be in the form of GitHub discussions. So a link to this GitHub discussion. I know I've got an AI to create a GitHub discussion on the CRD lifecycle. And there's also some good call outs to the extensions versus policy attachment discussion. So GitHub discussions will be interesting for the next bit. So definitely follow up there.
There we go. Discussion 2628. I'll put a link into that.
Great. Great. Okay, well, with that, thanks everyone, and we'll talk to everyone next week. Have a great one.
Thank you.
See you.